Hey everyone, and welcome to this video. I'm Glenn, and this is episode 19 of the Oathsworn painting series. In this episode, I'm painting the Grove Maiden. If you're new to miniature painting, I hope you'll find this video interesting and helpful. If you enjoy what I do, please hit the like button and leave a comment. As usual, let's see how I painted this tree hugger and her friends. Let's begin. First, I removed all the mold lines by using a hobby knife and filled all the gaps by using the mixed sprue glue. Once the glue dried, I washed and cleaned the models in soapy water, rinsed them in clean water and let them dry. Then I primed the models with Chaos Black primer. Next, I used an airbrush to make a cinefall light effect by applying a white color from above, slightly angled to catch the sides of the models. This can also be applied by using a can of white primer. Now we're all set and good to go. I'll paint the models in sections, beginning with the Sentinels, followed by the Guardian, and finishing with the Grove Maiden. You can easily navigate the process using the timeline. To start, I worked on the Sentinels using the colors shown on the banners. First, I applied a mix of green and beige to the models, avoiding the needle shooters. Next, I painted the needle shooters with orange. I then moved to the bases using more speed paint. With the base coat complete, the models look something like this. To give each Sentinel a unique appearance, I painted all their bases slightly differently. Now I begin the layering and highlighting process using the colors shown on the banners. I start with a mix of green and yellow to layer the model, and adding brown tones as thin layers to shade the less exposed areas. For the curled Sentinels, I found the shadows too dark, so I added brown tones to make the shadows more interesting. Afterward, I went back with the green and yellow mix to clean up those areas. Returning to the bases, I used similar tones as before, applying them randomly, just as I have done in previous videos. Once again, I made sure to paint each base slightly differently. Here's another example. I picked out the smaller roots using tones of brown and off-white, while the larger ones were painted in darker tones. With the bases almost complete, they look something like this. For the needle shooters, I use tones of orange, starting with a bright orange on top and a brown underneath. Next, I added a bit of yellow to the orange and focused on the exposed areas. Then I highlighted with a mix of orange, yellow and off-white. To enhance the shading, I followed up with orange speed paint. I returned with the orange, yellow and off-white mix for highlights. And finished with bone white for the final edge highlights. As a final step, I used the orange speed paint again to add depth and shading. Moving back to the bases, I added some details using blue, pink and yellow tones to create small dots resembling fungus or mushrooms. These details were applied randomly across all the bases for a natural look. With the Sentinels complete, they look something like this. Next, I basecoat the Guardian and the base using the colors shown on the banners. These are applied in a random manner, aiming for green and brown tones. Here I started the layering process using the colors shown on the banners. I start with green, focusing on the raised areas. After that, I follow up with 3 desaturated colors: beige, green and grey. The order doesn't matter much, I pick them randomly as I go. Next, I mix a bit of bone white into these same 3 colors for further highlights. For the vines across the model, I paint them with a mix of green and yellow. For additional highlights, I mix in more yellow. I also stipple on bone white for a textured effect. In general, I apply dark brown to the shadowed areas. I also add small touches of brown across the model for variation. I add touches of green in certain areas. And highlight them with yellow. To enhance the highlights and add texture to the edges, I use the stippling technique with bone white. Continuing with the rest of the model, I follow the same principles. I start with a dark brown for shading. Then layer with the desaturated colors. And the green tone as well. I paint the vines using tones of green and yellow. And apply the desaturated colors mixed with bone white for highlights. For additional texture, I stipple on bone white. I also decided to create areas with a fresh green tone and a hint of yellow, resembling blossoms. And here I simply add touches of green. For the tree stumps on top, I aimed for a brown and greyish finish. As you can see, the top is painted much brighter on the raised areas and edges, while the chest is done in a more green shade. The different body parts are intentionally painted with subtle differences, as if the body is pieced together from various trees, with the fresh green vines binding it together. For the head, I start with brown tones. Then layer with the desaturated colors, this time only with beige and green. I use bone white for highlights. And followed up with a thin coat of green. I go back and forth between bone white and the green tone to brighten the area and create contrast. Here I add touches of brown. And finish the head with bone white using the stippling technique, adding the final highlights. I had an idea for the Guardian to have a glowing heart in the orange area, but I abandoned that idea. Instead, I painted it like the other areas using the same colors and techniques. With the model almost complete, it looks something like this. I added more blossoms in tones of green, yellow and orange. These were applied randomly across the model. I painted the base using the same colors and techniques as before. To add interest, I included blue and yellow as fungus or mushrooms. Continuing on the Maiden, I basecoat her using the speed paints shown on the banners. In general, I use green tones on her body, grey tones on her right arm and the vines on her back, and orange on the hair. To ensure good coverage, I apply a second coat of speed paint using the same colors. and allowed the first coat to dry before applying the second one. At this stage I have applied a second coat to the entire model, finishing with the hair. For the layering process I used the colors shown on the banners, starting with brown to shade the legs. Next I use desaturated green and beige to transition between the shadows and the exposed areas. I follow up with a thin coat of green on the more exposed areas. Next I use a mix of green, yellow and bone white. Here I gradually highlight the vines on her legs, using green, yellow and bone white. After a few coats of green and yellow, I briefly paint the vines with bone white. Then I apply a thin coat of green to tone down the brightness slightly. And finally I use bone white again, applying it with the stippling technique to add texture. On the chest, I used the colors shown on the banners and followed a similar process. I start with a light green to match the tone of the legs. Brown was incorporated into the recesses for added depth. I gradually highlight the raised areas using a mix of green, yellow and bone white. And finished using stippling with bone white as the final highlight. Her left arm was painted using the same approach. For the vines, I used the colors shown on the banners and begin with a brief coat of brown. I then apply layers of the desaturated colors. To add variation, I incorporate a few green spots. To finish off the green spots, I stipple on a yellow tone. And follow up with light grey on the exposed areas of the vines. Finally, I apply bone white to the most exposed areas as the final highlight. Her right arm and the armor piece on her waist was painted using the same process. Moving to the head, I use the colors shown on the banners. I begin by using green tones to clean up and define the face. Brown was applied to the recesses. I apply brighter green tones to enhance and brighten the face. And finish with a final highlight of bone white using the stippling technique. For the hair, I start with a brown base coat. And transition to a mix of brown and orange. I follow up with pure orange, focusing on the edges and the ends of the hair. To create a gradient effect, I use yellow to highlight the edges and tips. Then I added a touch of white to the ends and edges for extra vibrancy. I glaze over the white with a thin coat of orange and yellow to create a vibrant look. For the final highlight, I apply bright yellow to the most exposed and raised areas. I use green tones to create a neat transition from the face to the hair. And stipple on a bit of bone white as the final highlight. For the eyes, I use the colors shown on the banners. I begin by painting the eye sockets white. And then I applied a thin coat of plasmatic bolt. Here I use a brush to soak up the excess. And did some cleanup to narrow down the eyes. And here I place another thin layer of plasmatic bolt. The speed paint is dry and I place a white dot in the eyes. As the final step on the eyes, I framed them using brown to define the eye sockets. After completing most of the model, I decided to refine the skin on the legs and her left arm. This involved brightening those areas to give the skin a more vibrant and polished appearance. For this, I used green, yellow and bone white. I painted the base as usual with tones of brown, green, yellow and off-white. The branches or roots on the base were painted similarly to the vines on her back. The leaves were painted with tones of green and yellow. And for added details I painted pink dots as fungus or mushrooms. Then I went the 2 laps around the base rim with a black color. I attached tufts and flowers to all the bases using super glue. And added some tufts onto the guardian as well. And as the final step, I applied Matt Varnish for a matte finish and to protect the paints. And with that, let's have a story before the final result.
I ran faster than I ever thought my legs could carry me. The trees whipped past me, the branches clawing at my skin. And the creatures, they were right behind me. I didn't dare to look back. My legs were giving out, my lungs burned, my whole body ached. But the terror somehow kept me moving. Everything went so fast, some of us got separated from the rest of the company. I didn't even know where I was running to. Just away. And then I saw the bodies. People I knew, my friends, scattered all over like broken dolls tossed aside by a careless child. Sven the tailor, His head was propped up against a tree, eyes wide open, mouth hanging slack like he was screaming for help. Poor Sven. That's when my feet caught a dead body, and down I went, face first into the mud. I scrambled to get to my feet. I could hear them getting closer, their growls thick with hunger, and the horrifying sound they made. I dared to turn, and there they were, no less than 3 of them, twisted, hulking things. Too many limbs, too many eyes, and a hunger that made my blood run cold. The one in the front bared its fangs at me. I knew right then I was done for, as it lunged forward. I closed my eyes, waiting for death to claim me. But it never came. Time dragged. Each heartbeat felt like a lifetime. Then there was a sickening sound, and then something hit the ground. I opened my eyes again. There were vines wrapped around the beast. Thick, dark tendrils shooting from the shadows, coiling around its body and dragging it into the dark. The thing screamed as it was yanked away, disappearing into the darkness. I could hear it thrashing, bones cracking, something tearing flesh apart. The 2 other creatures froze, turning their growls towards the darkness of the trees. And then my savior emerged from the shadows, elevated by twisting roots. A feminine figure with glowing eyes that pierced the darkness, spores drifting lazily around her like embers caught in a gentle breeze, casting an otherworldly light on the twisted underfoot. I'd heard stories about her kin, like the ones living in the green streets, but nothing like this. She was slender and tall, taller than any human. Her skin looked like the bark of an ancient tree, and her hair a mass of twisting vines, alive and moving on its own. And behind her, these massive, living things made of wood and roots, like some twisted mockery of trees. She stretched her arm gently and dropped something. I could barely see it, a seed perhaps. It hit the ground, and I'll never forget what happened next. That tiny seed sprouted immediately. Vines shot out from it, faster than anything I've ever seen. They slithered through the dirt like snakes, wrapping around one of the creatures and lifting it right off the ground. The thing shrieked and thrashed around, but it didn't last long. The vines tightened, squeezing, and then crack! Thing crumbled like a clay jar under a heavy boot, its body collapsing in on itself, bones and all. And as for the last one, phew, pillar's mercy. Those vines, they burrowed under its skin. I could see them wriggling around in there, pushing up beneath the flesh, making it bulge and writhe in the most horrible way you can imagine. The thing howled, clawing at itself, trying to dig the vines out. They were everywhere, twisting through its whole body. Its skin stretched, pulling tighter and tighter. I could see its bones shifting underneath, like it was going to burst, and then blood. So much blood. The creature's body just came apart. I sat there, shaking, covered in gore, just staring at her. She didn't look at me, not at first. She was focused on the dead things and the mess she'd made. The vines slowly withered in place, curling and drying into brittle, blackened strands. The husk of the creatures dangled from them, twisted, unrecognizable. A grotesque reminder of the carnage. She then turned, her glowing eyes piercing into me, her guardians behind her, standing still as statues, creaking softly in the wind. Finally, I found my voice. It was weak. I was trembling, but I managed to ask, "Who? What are you?"
accursed creatures stand at our gates, and the Painting Chronicles Brotherhood stands at the ready to face this evil. Join our cause by subscribing, and we shall triumph together. Pillar and Path Brothers. Also like and comment.